The man sprinted through the hallways of Site-01 as fast as he could. Bullets whizzed over his shoulders as panic shouts went up all around him. The whole facility was bathed in red as security alarms deafened his ears. He had to move fast, had to get out of here before it was too late. A force smacked him in the back so hard that he fell onto his face, skidding across the vinyl floor. Planting both hands on the ground and trying to push himself back up, he felt his right shoulder blade creaking and bending against itself. He'd been shot enough times in his life to know what a bullet-shattered bone felt like. Trying his best to ignore the pain washing through his body, he kept running. More bullets hit him in his torso, his shoulders, his arms, and his neck. One even caught the top of his skull, slicing a clear line through his hair, but he kept running. The doors were slowly closing in front of him as the Foundation personnel swarmed the hallways. All he had to do was make it to those doors, slide through the gap, and he'd be free. If only they could understand. If only all the agents, researchers, and the Overseer Council could make sense of what he was telling them, they would let him go through these doors instead of trying to shoot him down like a dog. Just 10 feet to go. He was nearly there when a bullet ripped through his calf and sent him tumbling to the ground again. But this time, before he could get up, a rain of bullets washed through his body, igniting a pain so fierce that he wished it could all just be over. But it never was. The pile of pitiful remains was wheeled back into a containment cell with a door locked behind it. You would think the body lying on the floor was some kind of roadkill, but it was in fact a man. A man whose body slowly and painfully, over the course of 4 months, pushed every one of the 247 bullets out of itself and got to work stitching itself back together as he lay there weeping on his own. Andrea Twain had been headhunted by the Foundation while she was still in college. Sitting in a Harvard library, she'd been hard at work on her thesis, pouring hour after hour into researching jellyfish. She was starting to see them in her sleep, and she was falling asleep at her desk quite a lot. Fueled by energy drinks and cups of coffee, it was starting to seem like the jellyfish were floating all around her between the bookshelves. That's why when she was approached by Foundation operatives offering her a place studying the most top-secret entity on the planet, she was pretty sure it was all in her head. But then, 6 months later, and living in a facility that she didn't even know the location of, it started to dawn on her the gravity of the task she had been handed. Her research topic had been the Hydrosian Turritopsis dohrnii, a small jellyfish with the power to reverse the aging process, dubbed the immortal jellyfish. She had been right on the verge of cracking what was the creature's genetic makeup that made it able to produce cells younger than those that they were replacing, a feat that could cure all number of human diseases and revolutionize medicine and society as we know it. But standing at the window in Site-01 and looking through the glass at SCP-001, Andrea realized that all of her research had barely scratched the surface of what was possible. On the other side of the window sat SCP-001. To many, this SCP was probably very disappointing to look at. It wasn't a giant reptile, it couldn't teleport around the facility, it didn't even have any visible powers or really anything to distinguish it from any of the other researchers sitting on the other side of the glass. It looked entirely like a regular human male. It was housed in a standard humanoid containment cell with no added security features. It was sustained on a standard humanoid meal program, 3 square meals a day with the correct number of calories, nutrients, and vitamins. If anything, SCP-001 probably had a more balanced diet than Andrea herself did. Some researchers have questioned the need for feeding this SCP. It was immortal, totally unkillable, and resistant to aging. It had been burned alive, drowned in acid, and beaten to a pulp, and yet very slowly, it would always recover. So why did they feed it? If they didn't, it would get quite grumpy. More than anything in the world, Andrea was desperate to talk to it. Containment procedures were very strict around this SCP. There would be no contact beyond the delivery of meals, no conversations, no sign language, nothing. It would sit by itself alone in silence, and 3 times a day, a meal would be placed in front of it by a researcher who would promptly leave. The reason? SCP-001 could predict the future. Initial research into this SCP found that it had an uncanny ability to describe events that had not yet occurred, despite having no exposure to the outside world. It could predict an entire season of Major League Baseball, right down to the individual player performances. It foretold the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Chernobyl meltdown, 9/11, the crash of the housing market, and countless other events. In 2004, a careless researcher asked SCP-001 what the weather was looking like. SCP-001 proceeded in detail to describe Hurricane Katrina, from its formation through to the humanitarian response and the political fallout, a full year before any of those events unfolded. The Foundation has tried and failed to use these predictions in order to prevent tragedies from occurring, but due to ironic twists of fate, any attempts to prevent these predictions from coming true often wind up fulfilling them. In the case of Chernobyl, agents who were deployed into the Soviet Union to work in the power plant itself wound up making critical blunders that led to the reactor's meltdown. If the Foundation had not gotten involved, the accident would have been averted. That said, taking a passive approach does not appear to be an effective countermeasure either. It seems that whatever SCP-001 predicts, that course of history becomes inevitable. How could you not want to talk to such an entity? As Andrea stood at the glass watching it, she knew she had to hatch a plan. The Foundation may not be able to prevent these tragedies from occurring, but surely they would want to know what's going to happen. They were researchers after all, and their job was to discover information. Predicting the future, that was the most valuable information of all. But it went deeper than that. If anything, the predictions of the future were a byproduct in Andrea's mind. There was something suspicious going on with this SCP, something that the Foundation was trying its best to keep under wraps. She had seen it in the classified documents, files left out on desks that should have been locked away securely. Security and procedure had grown lax with the monotony of containing this SCP. In these files were interview snippets, a chance for this SCP to reveal who it truly was. At the start of the first interview, Dr. Lynch simply, pleasantly greeted SCP-001. He replied, "Your daughter will be hit by a bus before her 7th birthday. I can tell you the specific day if you'd like." The interview session was paused as Dr. Lynch grew distressed and had to leave his post to go and spend time with his family. The interview resumed under Dr. Goldstein, who asked SCP-001 why he felt the need to give such distressing information to Dr. Lynch. He replied, "I have told you people countless times before, you are not to refer to me as SCP-001. I am the founder of this organization and you will address me as such." When Dr. Goldstein questioned that assertion, SCP-001 replied, "You really don't believe everything they have on file, do you? Address me as founder or I will tell you about what your husband is up to, Dr. Goldstein." Things collapsed very quickly after that. Andrea's plan started, as so many great plans do, with her sprinkling a chemical compound over one of her colleagues' Cheerios. It was nothing poisonous, well, at least not that poisonous, but it would put him out of action for a few months, long enough for her to assume his position. Andrea had been next in line for a while to take over the role of meal deliveries for SCP-001, and as her fellow researcher violently vomited into a bucket in the corner of their office, she knew that her time had come. With the plastic tray in her hands, loaded with some kind of beige slop and an apple, she waited in the doorway, ready for the seals to hiss and the door to slide slowly open for her. She stepped into the room, trembling. She had expected the air in here to be stale, breathed and rebreathed for decades by the same man. But of course it had been expertly filtered and purified by the Foundation systems. The air in here was as clean and balanced as it had been on the other side of the glass. The founder looked up at her as she walked towards him. She would be a new face to him, something he hadn't seen for the prior 5 years. His eyes dug into her, showing no surprise at all. She suddenly realized that, of course, he wouldn't be shocked to see someone new. He could see the future. He knew that she was coming. Suddenly unsure of herself, she wondered what else he knew about her future, about her most closely guarded secrets, about whether her plan would work at all. Andrea placed the meal in front of him silently, knowing that the cameras and microphones were all paying close attention to her. Subtly as she could, she nodded at SCP-001, turned around, and left the room. Andrea's heart hammered as she sat back down on the other side of the glass with her colleagues. Her entire plan hinged on one thing: monotony. All of the checks, all of the vigilance, all of the scrutiny that had been poured into SCP-001 for decades had to have faded by now. Faded just enough for the person watching the security cameras not to notice one word etched into the plastic tray: as SCP-001 took its spoonful of food. Now! SCP-001 launched from its chair and sprinted towards the door in the corner of the room. Before any of the other researchers could react, Andrea slammed a hand on the open door button. There was a hissing sound, and the SCP was free from its containment cell. Confused voices filled the room, yelling over one another in utter confusion. They had all been so caught off guard that none of them had paid attention to what had just happened. Before they had time to put the pieces together, Andrea was out of the door herself, running down the corridor. There was just one door between her and the SCP. She ran over to key in the security code to open the door and let the SCP out. But before she could even touch the keypad, a bullet caught her in the chest, and she collapsed to the ground, wheezing. A scared security agent stared at her wide-eyed. "What have you done?" he exclaimed. Then, both of them turned to look at the locked door, waiting. Andrea Twain had not wanted to let the SCP out until she saw one specific line from an interview tape. SCP-001, referring to itself as the Founder, explained in patient detail how it was entirely supportive of the Foundation's goals, motivations, and actions. It had no intention of intervening with any of their work. It explained that all of their ideas were, in fact, its own, as it was the one who had created the Foundation in the first place. But there was something coming. A prediction that SCP-001 refused to speak out loud under any circumstances. It had just one request that it would repeat to every interviewer for decades after decade. They had to free it, so it could prevent that event from happening. It must be allowed to construct a device. Otherwise, well, it actually never explains that part. Neither does it explain what this device is, and point-blank refuses to allow another to build this device in its stead. Due to the unpredictability of what would happen if SCP-001 was allowed to construct this device, the Overseer Council has point-blank refused to entertain the notion, but Andrea just couldn't shake it from her mind. This SCP was capable of accurately and precisely predicting all number of future events right down to the granular details, no matter how tragic and how dark. Yet there was an unknown in its future. It didn't know whether it would be released or not. It had to beg for its freedom. Whatever it needed this device to defeat was clearly so powerful that it went beyond SCP-001's capacity to predict and understand it. There was an event coming that was so significant that it created chaos and uncertainty in SCP-001's perfect view of the future, and there was only one entity that Andrea trusted to be powerful enough to counteract this event. And as she lay there dying in a pool of her own blood, she looked up through the glass window in the door at the entity she trusted and watched as it keyed in the passcode to the door. The door slid open, and the SCP took off running along the hallway. With her dying breaths, Andrea told the SCP the passcode to the door that it had just opened, understanding the brilliance of what had just happened. The SCP had been able to open that door because it had seen the future where she told it the password. And with that, she smiled and laid her head down on the hard floor. Except SCP-001 did not manage to escape. It was gunned down in the hallway with 247 bullets that brutalized its body and was wheeled back into its containment cell, where it began the slow process of healing. For most of the research team, things went back to business as usual, albeit with slightly better security. But to the handful of researchers who really thought about what had happened, a sense of unease settled on their shoulders. SCP-001 would have known before it ran out of that cell and attempted Andrea's plan that its escape was going to fail. It would have known decades prior to the exact positions of the 247 bullets that pounded into its body. It would have known the searing agony that it would have to endure for months as its body slowly healed from its failed escape attempt. And yet, it had gone through with it anyway. What set of events had been put into motion when Andrea carved those 3 letters into the plastic tray? What greater purpose was SCP-001 working towards? And was it now too late to stop it? Now go check out SCP-001 15 files protected by a memetic kill agent, and SCP-001 You Are the Anomaly.